I've been working with product packaging for many, many, many years. I started in marketing in 2005, doing product catalogs for a small family business, and which I would eventually take over in terms of doing all of their digital marketing and e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I joined 2H Media in 2020, so I've been a partner with this company for a couple of years and working on Shopify throughout that time. But my knowledge in product packaging design goes way back further than that. I've done full packaging lines in toys and games, business-to-business wholesale, and grocery. So it covers quite a wide range of audience. A lot of my experience comes from the board game space, actually. I spent about 5 years there developing licensed properties for things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the board game, or Terminator, the board game, a bunch of different properties where I was working with different IPs and representing those both in branded assets for the games themselves and then as well as the packaging that the games came in. So that's some of the more creatively interesting packaging work I've done. And then quite a bit in the wholesale space, from my early days developing packaging for tattoo needles to more recently doing some work in cannabis nutrients packaging. So like I said, quite a range. All of this to say, I've been at this for a while and I know a thing or two about packaging. So hopefully I can share some of that information with you today and you get some value out of it. What we're actually going to cover in this workshop is some packaging requirements. So I mean your own requirements, your customers' requirements, and how to actually evaluate what's important in product packaging. And there's a lot of different aspects of that, which we'll cover in more detail. Order of operations. Most small business owners, in my experience, don't really know where to start in terms of exploring product packaging, in terms of establishing your needs, communicating those to a designer, and then ultimately seeking manufacturing, which ties directly into packaging timelines. How long does this whole process take? If you're trying to launch a product next week, it's probably too late to start thinking about your packaging. But we'll delve into that in a little bit more detail as well. A little bit of regional packaging requirements. I've done some packaging designs for Canadian markets right through to South African markets and European markets. And your regional packaging requirements really do differ quite a bit from location to location. So we're going to delve a little bit into some of the best practices for Canada and just some approaches to seeking out the most relevant information for developing packaging in whatever area you're trying to sell into. And then finally, we'll bring it home with packaging and your brand, talking briefly about some best practices to actually promote your brand through your product packaging, some things to avoid, and some things you really want to make sure you stay on top of. And then we'll finish up with some Q&A, circling back to any of the questions that we didn't cover throughout the presentation. So I want us to kick us off by talking about packaging requirements. Whenever you're developing product packaging, there's a little bit of an artistic side to it where you're trying to come up with something that's visually appealing and really going to catch the eye of consumers. But I like to take a very methodical approach to developing product packaging. And the way this starts is determining the needs of all parties that have a vested interest in what this product packaging is going to do. So functional packaging does a few different things, which are listed on screen. You want to check all your legal boxes, protect the contents, decrease your shipping costs, et cetera. I'm not going to read the whole list for you because you wouldn't get a lot of benefit out of me just reading the slides off. But what you have to understand is there's really 3 or 4 groups of people who are going to have different needs for your product packaging, and you have to weigh all of those when you're developing what your product packaging is going to look like. So as a business owner or manufacturer of products, you're going to have your own needs. Your distributors and retailers are going to have their own needs. And then finally, your customers may have completely different needs for the packaging. So what do I mean by that? Well, when determining your own needs, the first thing we need to do is look at needs versus wants. So I would say meeting all legal requirements and protecting the product are needs. Minimizing shipping costs is a really important want, but it can be less significant compared to making sure you don't get into any legal trouble and making sure your products arrive in one piece. And then things like foil printing or spot UV or any of those specialty treatments are probably less important when determining your minimum viable product for your packaging. So your actual needs as a business are going to be very practical in terms of how do I deliver my product safely to my customers for the lowest price without getting into any trouble. Your retailers and distributors, on the other hand, are going to be much more concerned with the mechanics of how they actually sell your product within their stores. So a couple of the key things to take into account here. Number one is shelf space. When you move into anyone else's store, your business is not going to be their top priority. They're worried about all kinds of other things. And one of those is actually dedicating the best shelf space to the products that are, number one, the best sellers, and number two, the easiest to work with. So what do I mean by that? Well, try to keep your boxes down to a standard size or a convenient size where it's actually easy for your customers to display your product in the premium areas of their store. In one of my earliest product packaging snafus back in my board game days, we had an error with one of our first print runs, and we ended up with a 14-inch box. Now, if you're familiar with product packaging at all, that's a massive, massive box for people to try to fit on a shelf. And so we found that our game either got relegated to the back of a store or the very top of highly stacked shelves where people weren't able to see the product. And that's going to immediately impact your sales. So getting the size of your product packaging right is an example of a retailer need. Another thing that's really important is making sure that your barcodes are easily located in one or more locations where people who are actually inventorying and scanning your products can do so with relative ease and actually keep their processes ticking along at a good speed. So these are things you want to take into account that aren't really going to impact your day-to-day operations, but are going to be really important in terms of how likely people are to want to continue stocking your product. Now, we've touched on your own business needs and your retailer needs. Unfortunately, those might be completely at odds with your customers' needs for your product. And so a perfect example of this is the maple syrup space. The expected method of storing maple syrup for many, many consumers, particularly in the gift market, is the traditional Kent glass style glass bottle or the maple leaf style glass bottle, both of which have incredible shelf presence and make for wonderful souvenirs for anyone purchasing in the Canadian gift store market. On the other hand, they are heavy, fragile, and take up an extremely awkward amount of space compared to the amount of actual product that they sell. So this is a perfect example where even though this packaging isn't going to meet any of your needs as a business owner or your retailers or distributors' needs in terms of being convenient to stock and shelf, you end up being forced to make some concessions there in order to support the needs of your actual customers. So this is where I start in terms of developing the right product packaging to represent your product and your brand, is by laying out all of the needs of all of these relevant parties and weighing those in comparison to each other. And this may mean that you need to come up with different product packaging for different applications. So continuing to look at this maple syrup example, Jacob's Maple Syrup has completely different product packaging for their restaurant customers compared to their grocery customers and gift store customers, because those markets have fundamentally different needs. Now, establishing what those needs are going to be isn't universal. This isn't something we can cover within the scope of this workshop, but these are the kinds of questions and kinds of things you want to be asking yourself in the planning phase for your product packaging. Which brings us right into our order of operations. The first thing you want to do is get a solid list of what your requirements are in terms of legal needs, budgetary restrictions, manufacturing quotes and minimums, what your actual product needs to ship in terms of keeping it safe, providing it for your customers, all kinds of things that you want to write down and record. Because at the end of the day, when you reach out to a designer or agency to actually help you envision and create your product packaging, they're not going to come to the table most likely with that full list of considerations. As a business owner, you're going to be responsible for providing that context in order for them to do a good job creating a creative representation of product packaging that meets all of those needs. Once you've kind of got all of those things in hands and you've got that documented, you're in a really strong position to reach out to a designer and actually start developing some ideas for what your product packaging might look like. A confident designer is going to be able to help you figure out your fonts, colors, sizing, any print finishes that are going to work well on your packaging, and maybe some premium materials as well. But before delving into any of those conversations with a designer, you really need to understand whether or not these things are actually necessary or useful in terms of achieving your goals for your product packaging. Finally, once you've got an idea of your needs listed down and you've spoken to some designers about actually envisioning and creating the packaging files, now you can look into manufacturing. And with manufacturing, there's going to be a whole series of questions you're going to want to ask your manufacturers and a whole lot of requirements, which we'll delve into in a little bit more detail later on. But in general, your steps for the manufacturing process are going through some revisions to make sure that your design files meet the needs of the manufacturer, reviewing digital proofs to ensure that everything is going to look right in print, and then ideally reviewing white samples and actual physical proofs to ensure that what you're getting from the manufacturer is close to what you're expecting. Now, all of these things take quite a bit of time. And like anything, the more you put into it, the better your results are going to be. So with product packaging, I recommend dedicating as much time as possible to the planning phase. And I mentioned this early on. If you're planning to launch your product in 2 weeks, the ship has probably sailed on custom packaging. These are things you want to be dealing with well in advance. In terms of planning out all of those details, the longer you give yourself to work it out, the better. I recommend starting to plan out your packaging details at least 3 months in advance. But really, it's one of the first things you should think about when launching a new product line. In terms of the design process, I've listed a window of 2 to 12 weeks in this slide, and really that range can be anything. But I think this is a solid ballpark in terms of what you can expect for a typical packaging launch. And you'll notice that that is still quite a wide range, even in terms of what I presented here. So a little bit of context on where that comes from. That 2-week mark, that's pretty optimistic. And that's really if you're working with a designer that you've got some experience with on a product packaging line that they've got some experience with, getting a very short turnaround like that may be realistic. Maybe you're releasing an organic version of a product line that you've already created, and they're taking an existing label template, swapping some of the colors and ad copy and giving you back something new that still fits with a bunch of criteria they're already very familiar with. On the far opposite end of the scale, if you're developing anything like custom window boxes with unique cutouts to show off your product in a very specific way, developing new formats for something that's brand new or very experimental, this is going to take longer and longer, particularly if you want to spend a lot of time fine-tuning what it's going to look like in any kind of revision and approval process. So make sure you give yourself enough time to plan and present your designer with something that's actually going to give them a good start. And then also make sure you give yourself enough time to work back and forth with the design process, because getting the most out of your product packaging is a very involved process that requires a lot of communication. Once you get through the planning and design process, you start to move into the manufacturing process. And from here, you may need to continue working with your designer to work out some of the kinks as your design files get translated into whatever the manufacturer specifically needs. And manufacturers from all over the world are going to have completely different requirements for what their print files actually look like. Some will handle a lot of the process in-house. Others will expect your designers to handle the bulk of the process. It really just depends on the manufacturer you're working with. So give yourself enough time to get that done right. And particularly give yourself enough time to review physical proofs. I can't stress that enough. Any chance you get to review something physical, you're going to get better results out of that than relying on a digital print proof. And in the case where you're looking at something like that, you need to actually give yourself time for your samples to ship back and forth. If you're dealing with a manufacturer in China, expect much longer time frames than if you're working with someone locally. So take the time to do it right. I say 2 to 12 weeks there. That really comes with an asterisk that 12 weeks can be infinitely longer based on what kind of shape the world is in at the time. Particularly with the COVID-19 crisis over the last couple of years, we've seen massive delays in manufacturing processes across numerous industries. So again, the more time you give yourself here, the more successful your results are going to be. Following manufacturing, the next thing you have to get into is shipping your product. And I mean shipping your product to your distribution center, not to your customers. That's an entirely separate part of the process. But if you're getting ready for your products to sell in hand, give yourself plenty of time for them to arrive. Again, quite a range there. I said 2 to 12 weeks. On the short end, if you're working with a limited size print run and a local manufacturer, usually you can get a pretty quick turnaround time. If you're dealing with print runs in the thousands of units, working with a manufacturer overseas, expect several weeks or even months for your product packing to arrive in hand. The next thing we're going to get into is some manufacturing basics. But before we kick ahead, I just wanted to check in and see if we've had any questions coming in the chat.
Nope, there was just a quick question about just reading the timeline here, and it is 2 to 12 weeks per phase. So like Aaron mentioned, that each one is going to have a minimum, and then we've kind of put a maximum amount on there as well, even though, you know, if you want to blow the budget in terms of your time budget on each one of these phases, you're more than welcome to do so. You can do a revision after a revision, and your design will take a lot longer than 12 weeks. And just like you mentioned, if you're ordering 500,000 of something or 100,000 of something, your shipping times and the manufacturing time lead times might need to be adjusted for that. Another good question. When you are early, nimble, what's the best way to find a designer for CPG products? That's a good question.
CPG products. Can you elaborate on the acronym?
Consumer packaged goods.
Consumer packaged goods. What's the best way to find a designer? It really depends on how involved you're looking for them to be in the process. If you're looking for someone who's going to really help you with the bigger picture and know the industry, know the process a lot better, I'd look at reaching out to an agency for support. This is something we do. We help a lot of businesses with, and really it does take quite a bit of experience to know the ins and outs of the entire process. On the other hand, if you have a lot of it in hand already and you're looking for someone to help you with some of the basic design work, I'd be looking for any kind of freelance graphic designer. Or if you're managing a lot of different product lines and dealing with hundreds of SKUs, this may be something that's worth hiring in-house. I know some of the food service companies I've worked with have worked with external agencies to develop a brand and a unified look for their product packaging, and then relied on internal designers to actually manage the day-to-day of new product launches and creating new assets that fall within that larger established brand. Great question. Okay.
We can also help you with this. So if you do want to stick around afterwards, I will absolutely help you answer some questions. If you do have some questions about the design process in terms of a CPG product.
Great question. So go ahead, Matt.
I don't think there are any other questions so far. I'd continue on.
Perfect. So I'm going to kick us forward into manufacturing basics. Now, what I mean by that, we're going to talk about comparing local manufacturing and foreign manufacturing. And we're going to cover some important questions that you should run over with any prospective manufacturer you're considering working with. So comparing and contrasting local manufacturing versus foreign manufacturing. What's the difference? Well, local manufacturing can be expensive, straight up. You're going to get quite a few cost savings by dealing with by manufacturing your packaging in bulk with a supplier overseas. However, local manufacturing is great for small runs. It's where we typically recommend small businesses start in terms of developing some of your earliest packaging lines. It's also inexpensive to ship typically. When you're dealing with a manufacturer overseas, they're often going to ship free on board, which means you're responsible for dealing with large pallets of your shipments sitting on a cargo ship that you've now got to get into Canada and deal with the expense and logistics of getting that to your warehouse. And it's often less complicated to deal with a local manufacturer. You don't have to deal with any of that. You don't have to deal with any communications barriers. Often you'll have a better time picking up the phone and actually having a one-on-one conversation with a local manufacturer compared to an overseas manufacturer. And then typically your local manufacturers are going to be more reliable in specialty cases. For any kind of custom prototyping or new designs, I recommend starting with somewhere local to refine the idea and then consider moving overseas in order to scale. So what do I mean by that? Overseas manufacturing is best for large runs. I'd say minimum 5,000 units or more, whereas local manufacturing is great for if you're looking at a few hundred units to a few thousand units. You can manufacture locally right up to 20,000 units or so, but I just wouldn't even look at manufacturing overseas until you're into the thousands of units. The price points just aren't going to make sense. The savings won't really kick in until you start to get to those sizes of volume. Some other basic manufacturing things to consider in terms of developing your print runs with either a local manufacturer or foreign manufacturer. How do you get to that minimum order of SKUs? Some great things to do are to take a look at your product lines and figure out which products can share some product packaging basics. So what do I mean by that? Maybe your products come in buckets or boxes or food containers, whatever that is. If you can use a standardized format for all of your product packaging across a variety of product lines, you can then manufacture those portions or purchase those portions of your product packaging in larger quantities, getting some bulk rates, and then customize those with stickers or labels or whatever's going to be required to give each of those product lines a more unique feel. For most small merchants, this is going to be the best place to start. If you could ship every single product you carry in the same box or container and throw a different label on those or different tag on those to represent different types of products, you're going to have massive savings there compared to actually coming up with unique packaging for each of your different product lines. So that's a little bit on local manufacturing versus foreign manufacturing, and some ideas on how to actually meet some of the minimum order quantities. Important questions to that note for your manufacturer. What is your minimum order quantity? The first thing you should ask any manufacturer you're considering working with. They're all going to have completely different answers for you. Typically, like I mentioned earlier, if you're working with any manufacturer overseas, expect larger minimum order quantities in the thousands. Some local manufacturers will go down as low as a couple of hundred units. In general, always look for larger order quantities to see what your price breaks are going to be. When you reach out to any given manufacturer for packaging quotes, I always recommend picking 3 different volumes and requesting quotes for each of those price points. This is going to give you an idea of where your money is actually going in terms of getting the most for it. A perfect example is we recently had a client reach out for some label quotes, and they reached out for 200 units, 800 units, and then 2,000 units. And the price breaks were so significant with quantity that the price for 800 labels versus 200 labels was almost identical. So at that point, you're really not saving anything by trying to do too small a run. The only real consideration for doing a smaller run is if you've got physical spacing limitations in whatever your distribution center is, or your internal warehouse, in which case you may want to consider a smaller run just to try things out until you can get things to scale. But in general, always at least ask the manufacturers you're considering working with what they can do for you when you reach some larger price points, because that's going to really help you plan out it's going to help you to establish an accurate budget for your product packaging. Do you provide physical proofs? I touched on this a little bit earlier. This is a humongous one that often gets missed and often gets rushed over when people don't give themselves enough time to establish their, to go through the manufacturing process with care. I cannot stress enough the massive difference between a physical proof and a digital proof. If you're working with an established manufacturer doing something highly custom, I would typically expect them to provide a digital proof first to get an idea that they've got the correct print files. Everything looks on a computer the way you would expect it to based on what you've sent them. And then also provide you a white box sample. And what that is a physical copy of a printed and cut piece of product packaging that's going to fit your unique spacing and die line requirements, but doesn't have any of your artwork applied yet. This is sort of the first round of physical samples to say, yes, the actual cut of what I'm expecting is accurate. This physical thing is the right thickness, the right shape, the right size, everything I would have expected of this product. And then finally, I would expect a print proof before the full manufacturing run, where they can show you what your product packaging will actually look like when they spin it up for full production. Now, often print proofs are printed on a separate printer to large scale runs. So your print proof may not be 100% accurate depiction of what you're actually going to get in a larger manufacturing run, but it's still a really good way to check to make sure that your print files are behaving correctly when used on a physical printer. You may be surprised by some of the things that can happen. I've seen overprint errors where the colors come out completely wrong and the file looks great on a computer monitor, but doesn't look so good in print. And these are things that are just impossible to tell from a digital proof. So really hash out with whatever manufacturer you're considering working with, especially on larger print runs, what they're willing to provide in terms of physical proofs, because it can be the difference between an extremely successful product line launch or an absolutely disastrous packaging mistake. A really common area where people neglect physical proofs and it comes back to bite them is if you're packaging your product in any kind of tapered container. It can be very difficult to get the curve on a tapered label right so that it fits properly against a tapered container without any kind of bubbles or bulging. And that physical proof is the best way to actually take one of those printed labels, walk it over to whatever your container is going to be, and see if it fits the way you're expecting it to.
I want to highlight something there when it comes to a digital versus physical proof as well. You are viewing, everyone here is viewing the presentation through a monitor. You'll see that some of the fonts are coming in black and red, and there's a white background. Based on your monitor settings, those colors and fonts can look a little bit different. So when you're viewing a label or some kind of product packaging, and if your monitor isn't color corrected or color graded, or if it's just old, you'll actually see something that is unknown to you, but the counterpart, whoever sent over those files, is seeing the true version of it. So there is a quicker version of getting this. I would check those files, those digital files, on a modern smartphone. So iPhones and like anything built in the last 2 years has fairly decent color rendering on the actual screen. If you're using an older computer monitor or a laptop, you will see different color. So keep that in mind. This does not negate the fact that you still should get a physical copy. You should definitely see it, touch it in the physical, because there's still things that can happen. But yeah, what you see is not always what you get when it comes to color through a monitor.
I'm just checking the comments. I'm seeing a few comments come through, and I'm scanning for any questions.
There's a Therese had a good comment, not so much a question, but yes, if you're thinking in selling in 2 different countries, they may have, and I say may, there's normally a different set of prerequisites to sell in 2 different markets. So if you're doing like Canada versus US, there might be some language that you have to have. If you're selling in the Canadian market or into Quebec, you might need to also have the French version or English, Spanish. So you definitely need to take into account where the product's actually going to be. And then if you are having it warehoused or distributed in a different location, those are some big things that you need to take into consideration. And yes, it does take longer. And I think Aaron's actually going to get into this a little bit more. But
I touched a little bit on regional packaging later on, mostly Canadian, but I can speak a little bit to some foreign markets as well. It's one of those things that you're going to be responsible for doing your own research on. And thankfully, the governments around the world make it quite a bit easier than you might expect to do so. But like I said, we'll delve into that in more detail later. It is one of those things that you're going to have to really stay on top of your designer as a business owner to make sure it gets done correctly. A lot of designers try to take a very artistic approach and will often try to take liberties in terms of presenting product packaging in a way that they might find more visually pleasing, but doesn't necessarily meet all government regulations. When is it? So I'm seeing some great questions come through as well. I saw one question there was, are there any companies out there or consultants that can critique or offer improvement on existing packaging? Short answer is yes. Anyone who is offering new packaging designs should also be able to offer critique on existing packaging. I would absolutely take that as a starting point before considering hiring a designer or agency to assist in new product packaging designs. Assessing where you're at now is one of the first and most important steps in developing a plan to improve it going forward. So anyone who's going to help create new designs should be willing to look at where you're at now to get an idea of what your starting point is at. And if you're not looking for assistance in actually developing the new designs, but just looking for that review of what you've got currently, any agency or designer that's willing to produce the new content is very likely willing to do an audit of your existing brand to get you started regardless of how you choose to move forward. I'm also seeing, how do you go about finding a manufacturer? Great question. Google search is the shortest answer I could possibly give. It depends on whether you're looking for a local manufacturer or a overseas manufacturer. For a local manufacturer, I would literally just start calling up local print shops. There's quite a few around Ontario that are fantastic. We've done quite a bit of work with Direction Printing out of Kitchener. Excellent customer service. I will try not to get into too much detail on any given packaging manufacturer because there's a lot of great ones around. Minuteman Press, great at small print runs. Boxer Print, great at larger print runs. And these are just some names off the top of my head of local print companies that I've had experience working with. Ampersand in Guelph, known for doing quite high-end product packaging as well. There's a ton of local shops that you could reach out to. And then it's just a matter of having some conversations with them, evaluating their customer service, and generating some quotes for some of your packaging ideas. In terms of establishing overseas manufacturing, it's a lot dicier. There's some companies out there that can be disastrous to work with. I'll be honest, my first print run in the board game space had 100% defect rate. You expect, anywhere between a 2 and 5% defect rate when you're dealing with print runs of those sizes. But we were absolutely shocked by the poor quality of materials that we got back. And we simply hadn't done enough research and hadn't done enough vetting to select an appropriate manufacturer. Now, anytime you're in larger print runs and working with any company overseas, there's a number of things I'd be evaluating. So where to find them? You can look for them online. They all have websites. They're all try to promote quite aggressively. Try to talk to a customer service person. Evaluate how good their communication skills. You're looking for strong English language skills. How willing are they to explore different print concepts and explain things to you? All of these soft skills are going to be one of the best ways you can evaluate a manufacturer yourself. And then at the end of the day, the best thing you can rely on when sourcing an overseas manufacturer for a larger production run is word of mouth or past experience. So I would be reaching out to any other business mentors you may have in your space or a similar space, asking for recommendations, asking to connect to manufacturers they've worked with in the past. If your product is being sold into distribution, your distributors may have preferred manufacturers that they've worked with as well. So I'd be reaching out to any more established companies in your space for recommendations. And then again, any agency or designer you're working with to actually build the print files may have preferred manufacturers that they've worked as well, and may be able to offer some recommendations.
A good question in chat here. They sell a product right now, mainly online. It's a 22 by 12 by 6-inch plain cardboard box. When is it important to create a custom packaging or box? When is it important to make the switch from something plain into something more design and pretty?
We are going to circle back to that because I have a slide on that later in the presentation.
Perfect.
And I was just continuing to double check the chat before we move forward. Another thing to consider is making your shipping and handling company has credentials to go across border. Excellent point. I would also take a look at, for any large scale manufacturers overseas, what their certifications are in terms of manufacturing capabilities. Depending on what markets you're selling into, you need to look for Disney level certification, which implies that the manufacturers you're working with don't rely on any child labor, have safe working conditions for their employees. So double checking the certifications of any manufacturers or shipping companies that you choose to work with is super important. Just ask them. Usually they'll give you honest answers. Facebook groups can be helpful as well. I'd love to see people communicating in chat. It's great that you're working with each other as well. I don't have a specific recommendation for green packaging options, but that's something you may be able to inquire with any print shop on as well. They might be able to make additional recommendations for you.
The only company that I know that does the green stuff is Spicers.
Yeah,
a whole eco-friendly line from cotton to fibrous material, recycled cardboard to plant-based papers that are like ecologically farmed and produced.
To that point, I mean, there's also a big push going back to the packaging requirements. If eco-friendly is something that's really important to you, you may want to look at how your products are packaged in terms of whether or not the packaging is reusable. So we've seen a strong push towards, glass jars, sturdier boxes, things people may want to actually hang on to after the fact in order to continue getting value out of them after purchase. Because if you go back to your reduce, reuse, recycle, reduce and reuse are the first R's for a reason. Okay, continuing the conversation, let's talk about some premium finishes. This is one of the first things I typically get asked about when a small business is developing a new packaging line, and typically one of the last things that small businesses should be thinking about. I don't really recommend looking into premium finishes until you're printing at least 20,000 units. Even then, they're expensive, but trying to do something really, really custom with your packaging is one of the fastest ways to drive up your per unit costs in a hurry. Just to give you an understanding of it, though, and explain some of the language so that you know how to describe what you're looking for to any given designer that you may choose to work with. What are some of the premium finishes? Some of the most common ones you'll see are spot UV, which is glossy sections of your packaging. It's a print treatment where I'm sure you've seen it before on a lot of higher end or mass-produced products, where a logo or a word or an image might have a glossy finish on it to stand out from a otherwise matte surface. Foil printing, shiny sections. Anytime you've seen a glossy metallic finish to a piece of product packaging, that's typically a foil print. Embossing is raised sections, or you got to be careful with embossing, because the opposite of embossing is debossing on the other side of whatever you're printing. I've seen a lot of people try to do embossing on business cards and run into a debossed back face of their business card that doesn't look very appealing because they didn't think through the whole process. Then letterpress is imprinted text. It's a very subtle finish compared to embossing, where the text itself has a very slight debossed feel to it. And then, of course, premium materials, cotton, hemp, wood, metal. There's all kinds of things you can delve into to give your packaging a more refined look. I'm going to put a big asterisk here. I say the premium materials shouldn't be looked into until you're printing 20,000 plus units. And this is another one of those scenarios where if you can use portions of the same product packaging across a variety of product lines, you may be able to get into those premium materials a lot faster. So if you're shipping all of your product in the same metal tin, for example, you may be able to hit that 20,000 units across a variety of different product lines and then differentiate them with much cheaper labels printed in lower quantities. In terms of how a designer views any of these premium finishes, there's not a heck of a lot to it from my end. Usually they all just get separate print layers in a design file, which is what you're looking at on the left there. So if that's an example of a piece of product packaging we put together, where the pink rectangle in the middle represents a cutout of a window, and all of the blue sections represented a spot UV finish that was applied to various logos and icons. So typically the way this works from your designer, if you're curious about the process that goes into actually communicating these specialty treatments to a manufacturer, it's usually just going to be a separate print layer calling out specific elements of the design within your print files. So there's really nothing special that the designer is doing in terms of actually preparing these. There's really nothing special that a designer is doing in terms of preparing these files. You just have to indicate where everything is, and that's an open communication they should be able to have with you as the business owner in terms of which parts of your product packaging you're specifically trying to call out. Regional packaging is my next step, but before we get in there, I just want to double check to see if anyone has any questions on the premium print packaging processes. I see a thank you for saying that. I've wasted so much time looking into that. Yeah, it's a big one. A lot of people start here, and it's really not in the cards for most small businesses until you reach a certain scale. Please send a spec sheet. Can you guys touch on that? Not sure what you're looking for in a spec sheet, but if we can touch on it, we'd be happy to. What about digital carton print? I'm not sure what the questions are there. Can you be more specific?
I'm making a Google search. I've never even heard that before.
I'm going to move the conversation along. We'll circle back to this if we get more specifics on either of those questions. Oh, do you recommend digital for small volumes as opposed to offset printing? I would direct that question right back to your print house. They're all going to have different processes they prefer. Yeah, it's not something I have a strong preference on, to be totally honest, in terms of developing packaging lines. I've worked with different print shops that all have different approaches. Some of the manufacturers I've worked with use digital print for their print sample that we talked about, and then use offset for their actual runs, which is one of the things that can get tricky in terms of actually evaluating your print proofs. So it's something to ask about, but it's also something that I suspect most merchants who are starting out aren't going to have the technical knowledge to really evaluate the difference or notice much of a difference in the finished product. So
Aaron, do you want to take a quick second and just explain the difference between digital and offset printing?
It's very, very technical. So I don't really want to delve into it in too much detail. It is literally, it's how the ink is applied to the actual print surface of the material. Which is where I say that most merchants aren't going to get a lot of value out of differentiating. Where was I in the presentation? So regional packaging. Regional packaging, this is a big one. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, you are responsible for all requirements, so do your own research. Your designer, if they've got some experience, may ask some probing questions. Hey, have you thought about these things? Do you have safety markings for me? Have you registered all of your barcodes? Do you have a nutrition table? Sorry, I'm just seeing questions coming in the chat. I'm going to try to continue through my explanation of this slide, and then I'll circle back to those. Yeah, you're responsible for establishing your own label printing requirements. A good designer may ask some probing questions to establish some of the things you may have missed, but at the end of the day, they're not a lawyer. They're not an expert on the actual legal requirements. You want to be really knowledgeable about these things yourself and make sure you're on top of your designer to get this right. Now, the good news is various government resources make this extremely easy to find information on. It's dense, it's legal. If you know a lawyer or you work with a lawyer, it might be worthwhile to have them break down for you some of your specific requirements that you need to hit. But there's awesome Canadian government resources that break down step by step what your packaging requirements are for specific industries that have specific standards. When we send out these spreadsheets or these slides after this presentation, these links in the slides actually work. They'll take you straight to the government resources on these topics. They're an awesome, awesome starting point. I can't stress that enough. My absolute favorite one is the government nutrition label templates. So the Canadian government has actually put together a gigantic InDesign, Adobe InDesign file full of every possible format of nutrition label you could ever want to use on your product packaging, in the right fonts, in the right size, with instructions in terms of what size of label to use based on what type of food you're selling and what size of packaging you have available for that label. Every single designer in the world should be able to follow the instructions in that document. Don't resize it, leave it exactly the way they've given it to you. But all the information is there. It's exactly the format a designer wanted. All you have to do is request those files from the government. They'll send them to you free of charge, and you can pass those on to your designer and make sure they're using them. They're a great resource. Not a lot of designers know that it's there and ready to use, but it really is the best place to start in terms of developing your food packaging to make sure all of your labeling requirements are met correctly without making it up as you go along. Excellent examples in those documents of what not to do as well. They call out some specific examples of companies skewing and stretching their product packaging or their nutrition labels in ways that aren't allowed. I'm not going to delve into the details because, again, it's very, very technical, but it is seriously the best resource any designer could possibly rely on to get your nutrition labels right. And as a business owner, I would definitely be going to each of these websites and reading through those checklists to get an idea for yourself and to better develop an understanding of what your designer should be on top of in terms of actually building out your product packaging. And this, I mentioned I would circle back to this. All of this information is specific to Canada. For manufacturing with foreign countries, many of them have very similar resources, not to the same extent, but I know when I was doing product packaging for South Africa, for South African markets, their government websites listed out all of the same requirements in a very similar checklist. So I had to at the time create my own print files. They didn't give me the handy pre-designed ones that the Canadian government does, but all of the requirements were at least there in very uncertain terms so that I could go through them and get all of the information right and make sure that these designs were going to pass their standards. Now, if these are areas where you're unsure, again, my advice is always going to be reach out to someone who's more knowledgeable, reach out to any partner you're working with in the space who's already got an idea of what you're looking for. By the time you're reaching into international markets, if you're not just selling direct to consumer, there's a good chance you're working with a distributor or a wholesaler who's actually helping get your product into that target audience. That distributor or wholesaler is going to have someone within their organization who has a strong knowledge of what the product packaging requirements are in their local service areas, and they should be able to connect you to that person or connect you to the information you need to make sure you get this right. Rounding off our conversation on regional packaging requirements, common missteps that I see all the time. Number one, using the Canadian maple leaf. This is probably the biggest packaging misstep I see made by Canadian companies. That little 7-pointed Canadian maple leaf that we're all familiar with from the flag is a trademark of the government of Canada. Just because you're Canadian, just because your product is Canadian, doesn't give you any legal right to include that icon on your product packaging. I have seen businesses get fined and have to redo their product packaging because they printed massive runs of products and put them into grocery stores with that Canadian maple leaf on the labels unmodified. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use maple leaves at all. It just has to be a unique design that's clearly differentiated from the one owned by the Canadian government. Another big mistake I see, particularly in Canadian markets, is relying on free translation software. If you're selling in Quebec or any of the provinces that require bilingual packaging, make sure the French components of your product packaging are extremely clear and accurate translations. Google Translate will get you a chunk of the way there, but it's not going to do the whole job for you. You really need to have an actual human who does speak both languages fluently refine your translations to make sure they're done correctly. If you know someone in your personal life who's bilingual, at the very least, get them to give it a once over to make sure it makes sense. Or if not, hiring a translator is a relatively inexpensive cost compared to redoing a print run because you printed with inaccurate translations. In terms of how important this is important not just for Canadian legislative reasons. If you're trying to list your products with GS1, the barcode registry, which can be very important when bringing your products into distribution, you may get your listings denied if your translations are not to a high enough standard. So really stay on top of that. A lot of people gloss over it, skip entirely, or rely on machine translation. It's really something a human needs to be involved with. Shrinking barcodes and nutrition labels and disclaimers. I touched on this already when I mentioned that the Canadian government gives you very good standards in terms of what standards you must meet. Stick to those. A lot of designers will try to fudge a barcode or fudge a nutrition label to fit on a different size of packaging than it's really intended for. This will give you all kinds of problems in terms of missing your legal requirements and also in terms of practical requirements. If you shrink a barcode too small, it's just going to be very difficult for your retailers and distributors to scan. And we're right back to our initial conversation about making sure we meet their needs. Poor color contrast is another huge one. This comes right back to your branding before you even get into product packaging. Any competent designer or agency should be developing your brand colors to have strong contrast with each other so the text is highly legible. You can validate this very easily. There's a website called the 8 Shapes Contrast Grid. If you punch in all of your brand colors into that tool, it'll give you a full list of how they compare to each other in terms of contrast standards. And you might be surprised. A lot of brands have very artistic midtones that really don't give you a lot of contrast in terms of displaying text properly. This can be very challenging for your consumers, particularly if you sell to an older audience. I've seen this as a big deal in the food service space where people are using very soft, muted designs with a lot of midtones, and older customers simply aren't able to make out the text or images on the packaging at all. And then missing CE markings and safety markings. If you're selling anything in Europe, you need a CE marking, which self-certifies certain safety standards. And then you want your typical sad onion for no one from 0 to 3 using the product, depending on what it is. Reach out to or look at your local government government websites again. Any region you're considering selling into will have lists of safety markings that are recommended or required for your products. But make sure you have a list of what ones you require for your packaging prior to reaching out to a designer or agency, because they're probably not going to know. Real quick, checking the comments. I see Matt has left the contrast checker in there. Thank you very much for that. Holy big link. We do use this tool all the time. We use it whenever we develop a new brand. The site I advised was the 8 Shapes contrast checker.
That was the big link I just put in. The URL inherits all of the settings within the actual grid so that you can send it to people. This one is just a very basic one that you can see between white and black. You can input your own color codes into the grid, and it'll actually give you a rating in terms of how much contrast there is between the text and the background color. Fairly easy to use. You're looking for a AA rating or higher on most things. AAA is obviously the best. Anything under that, you'll either see it in a yellow or a red little icon saying that it does not pass contrast. So just because your eyes, you might have great vision, doesn't mean everyone else has. So this is taking into account a whole bunch of things in the back end, the algorithm, the way that works between determining what is legible is fairly straightforward for a computer. This is also a great tool to use on your website. So beyond the product packaging, color on your own website, foreground color and background color, you should be checking your brand colors for that. Oftentimes people are mixing colors that are just really not legible.
Right on. I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat, so I'm going to keep this conversation rolling into one of the key topics for this actual presentation, as established on the workshop page: packaging your brand. Packaging has a significant impact on how your consumers interact with your brand. A lot of the time, it's going to be the first thing they see if you're selling your product in a retail environment. And it's also one of the most important parts of the customer experience in terms of receiving your product if you're selling direct online through your Shopify store. How your packaging represents your brand, it's very, very personal. This is not something we can establish perfectly for all of your different businesses in the scope of a Zoom presentation, but we can touch on some best practices that are going to apply across the board. So the first thing I want to touch on is simplifying the design, regardless of your industry. I want to touch on leveraging unboxing, and then I want to delve a little bit into when to go premium, which brings us full circle on the question we were asked earlier. Simplifying the design. What do I mean by this? Way back in 2006, there was a classic YouTube video produced, which I highly recommend checking out after the fact. It's good for a laugh, and it's a really good representation of what I'm talking about here. Some cheeky and creative designers envisioned what it would have looked like if Microsoft was responsible for the iPod packaging. And if anyone's purchased a hard drive or a computer accessory back in the mid-2000s, you'll remember all kinds of crazy packed packaging layouts with all kinds of flyouts and stickers and extra bits of text and information that don't do anything at all to sell your brand, but really take away from the effectiveness of your packaging. So simplify the design across every industry. I cannot stress how often I see small businesses trying to pack additional slogans, company history, taglines, selling features into their product packaging, and it's really just not the home for it. The strongest things you can do in terms of developing pleasing product packaging are let the product itself stand on its own, make it very visible, give your brand room to breathe. Just fight that basic instinct to oh, where'd my slides go? You can tell I don't use PowerPoint very often. Fight that instinct to overcrowd your packaging. I know you've got a lot of company value, and there's an urge to explain that to your customers very explicitly, but really the best thing you can do in terms of creating eye-catching branded packaging is just simplify as much as possible and let the brand speak for itself. Now, in firm contrast to that, leverage unboxing. Your product packaging is the only part of your marketing strategy with 100% open rate. You're going to try and get 2%, 5%, 10% open rates on your emails. Better than that if you can. It's never going to be 100%. No one's going to open every ad. No one's going to open every email. Every single customer who receives your package is very likely going to open it up and want to interact with that product. So this is one of the best places to impact your customers in terms of how they perceive your brand and how they interact with your product. It's about creating an experience that's memorable, making it shareable, and including strong calls to action. So what do I mean by that? In terms of experience, one of the best sounds in the world is the sound of a can of soda or beer being opened. That click and hiss when someone opens that product and interacts with it immediately makes everyone else in the same room as them want one themselves. It makes everyone else want to get on board with this product. So that's creating an experience around just opening the product. Before they've got to even enjoy the product itself, actually just getting it out of the box is very enjoyable. And we're seeing that opening experience take on more and more importance in this Instagrammable shareable world that we now live in, where people are sharing unboxing videos and opening videos and allowing other people to experience secondhand what it's like for them to open and interact with your product. So putting some care and some thought into developing an experience where people open up your product and get to interact with it in a really unique way before actually using the product itself is a great way to not only engage with your customers and create a more memorable encounter, but also encourage them to share that product with others, which now gives you free earned marketing, which is an extremely powerful tool for developing your brand. And then finally, calls to action. We can actually get really explicit here. A lot of our merchants overlook the opportunity to include a thank you card in their product packaging. Even if you're in the plain UPS boxes, there's no reason you can't include either a printed 4x6 mailer or a handwritten note thanking your customers for purchasing your product and including a strong call to action. So what do I mean by that? One of the best things we can recommend is include a coupon code for repeat purchase. It's very easy to set up coupons in Shopify. If you don't know how to do it, one of our YouTube videos walks you through it step by step. But once you've got that coupon code, it's super easy to throw it on a handwritten thank you card or a printed proof or a printed mailer and just slip that into your packaging with every single thing that goes out. Because the benefit of turning all those one-time purchasers into repeat purchasers is massive in increasing your customer lifetime value. The last thing I want to touch on in terms of packaging and your brand is when to go premium. When the brand demands it, you should know. There's a few important factors you can look at in order to determine whether or not you actually need to be looking into those premium print finishes or custom product packaging. Number one is your product high margin. If you're selling a low margin product, simply financially speaking, don't waste the money on any of the premium finishes until you can afford it. Get your manufacturing costs down, get your volume up, develop in a larger bulk to make it financially affordable to develop those premium packages. Until it financially makes sense, I don't care what your business is, I wouldn't start looking into it until the numbers work. Additionally, is your industry highly competitive? There's tons of examples of this. If you're selling watches, jewelry, sunglasses, anything that is high margin, low complexity, tons of competition in the space, brand is very important. These are areas where you're going to really need to make sure that experience is on point and make sure that your customers feel like they purchased something premium right from the get-go. And then similarly, not commoditized. What do I mean by that? If there's 1,000 of the product, if it's something utility that people are purchasing for convenience, it's significantly less important to get these factors to develop a branded experience. In those cases, you're selling efficiency, you're selling convenience. The quality of your product packaging is going to be significantly important. This goes for selling things like razors, any products that are expendable. If it's something that people can get in bulk and they're purchasing online to make it more convenient, I wouldn't be worried about the premium product packaging.
Yeah, you're not going to see too much premium product packaging when it comes to diapers.
Exactly.
It's, yeah.
And then finally, it's really mostly important in consumer goods. If you're selling wholesale or you're selling a business product, your packaging is going to be significantly less important because though that target audience is going to be more swayed by the quality of the product and the delivery of the service than by any kind of flash in product packaging. So I hope that answers some of the questions about when you actually need to go premium. Those are the factors I would look at to evaluate it. If your industry demands it in order to stand out, if your margins allow and you're trying to create a premium experience around the product. That's when I would look at going premium. And again, you've got to get those print runs way up before it becomes feasible.
Some good questions in chat, Aaron, before you go on that are
okay.
That are on. You recommend the same parameters for handmade products?
I recommend the same parameters for handmade products. In terms of when to go premium, that's a good question. I would hope that your handmade products are high margin and highly competitive and not commoditized. So in those cases, yes, I would say the same parameters are pretty comparable. Most of the time, through nature of being a handmade product, you're probably in a space where the experience is more important to the end user. You're going to check a lot of these boxes out of the gate. Now, I'm not sure specifically what handmade product it is. the scope obviously changes depending on the scale of what you're building. Handmade furniture and handmade soap are completely different markets. But in any case, the short answer is the packaging needs to match the product. If you're selling a premium product, you're going to want premium packaging. Whether or not you can achieve that is all going to come down to logistics. If you're selling a handmade product, skin products, less lip care / products. Again, it would depend on it would depend a lot on your specific brand. There's I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. If you're selling a more rustic product with a handmade feel, you might want to go with a more handmade feeling packaging. If you're selling something where the ingredients are more what people are concerned about, and the story behind the product is more important, you can probably get away with a fairly standard and genericized packaging until you hit a scale where it makes sense for your brand. Anytime where you're selling something very personal, continuing to develop the brand through packaging that reflects your product line, I think makes sense, but you've got to hit a scale where that's feasible. In the early stages, I don't think it hurts a skincare product company or something handmade to go with whatever product packaging matches your budget and matches the scale of your operation.
There's a good question here that I'll answer. If you're a small business just starting, is it recommended to spend money on thank you cards, business cards, confetti in the package? Okay, so those are a couple of different things. The confetti, if it's just like the actual packaging material to make sure that your products aren't rattling around the box too much, and then that's going to ensure the product doesn't come damaged. You absolutely want to make sure the product does not end up damaged before the customer actually receives it. So there's certain levels of quality when it comes to actually, like, you don't need packing peanuts in every single box. You might just need to find a smaller box, or you might need something to actually encase the product so that it's not moving around too much. When it comes to thank you card, business card, I would avoid the business card in the box, but the thank you card, absolutely. Something that, again, when it comes to a small business owner, reviews are very, very important in getting that word of mouth marketing moving. Very, very important for you to start gaining some Google reviews or on-site reviews. So the cost of a handwritten card, like, you can go to Staples, buy some nice card stock, and write on the card with a pen saying, thank you very much for your order, we'd love a review, or something like that, and it's going to prompt someone for leaving it. Or you can run these through a standard printer, have a QR code that links to your Google My Business or to the product page, and then handwrite those cards for your small business owner. If you don't have the money, you probably have the time. For the cost of doing that, to get a Google review or a product review, hands down, best investment you could have. Like, you want as many reviews as possible when you're first starting out. Great for SEO, great for social proof. It's a great indicator that you're not actually a small business. People are building some trust with your brand. So yes, so you're going to need to find something affordable to keep your product from coming damaged. And then, yeah, you should have some kind of note card or something in the box. You don't need to go and spend a boatload of money on premium paper and it's got to be on cotton and it's got to do X and Y. Like, it needs to be authentic. It needs to have a very clear message. Handwrite them. Like, I mean, everyone orders things online now, so I get all kinds of them, and you're looking for instructions, go here. It's just, wow, someone took the time to handwrite this. Great. It feels more authentic. It feels like you're actually supporting someone, so it's not just a mass-produced product that you're buying off the shelf somewhere else. But yeah, you should have that. I mean, and the cost of a card is that's going to be pennies. That's going to be.
It should be one of the easiest investments you make when you're launching a new product line or starting a small business. It's a perfect example. A thank you card should make you more than it costs immediately.
Yeah.
Foil printing will not make you more than it costs for a very long time.
There's also great things where it's like the next, again, coupon codes like Aaron mentioned, or buy one for your friend if you like this. Great.
I always wish I could like comments in Zoom because I see a comment from Mary I would add a thank you card with the details of your story, a coupon code, and a coupon code to their next order online.
Yep.
And that's the typical, like, yes, that's following your best practices. That's the model. If you're wondering what to put on your card inside your packaging, that's exactly it. Say thank you, tell them a little bit about yourself to develop a connection, and give them a coupon code to encourage them to come back. The only thing I might add to that is ask for a review.
Yeah, there's some pretty cool tools in Shopify. So as you're printing, we are a Shopify agency, so we know a little bit more about this than I know there's a few people in the room that might not be on Shopify. You can actually see how many times that customer has ordered in the back end. So if they've ordered like their 6th product, having a handwritten card and you can actually personalize it a little bit, it's going to go a long way. So if you take the time to go and say, wow, this is either a first-time customer or it's a returning customer that has made, this is their 5th purchase, you can actually customize that quite a bit, and that does go a long way. And again, if they've made 5 purchases, they clearly like your stuff. So saying thank you, reaching out to them, there's a lot of benefit there. Rolling through the other questions here. You have any recommendations for packaging printers that are very good at designing pop-up display style packaging?
Very good at displaying pop-up display.
What are you trying to sell? Paint me a picture here. Pop-up display style packaging, like something that's going to sit vertically on a shelf, or he's getting something.
Sorry?
He's on his camera. He's going to show me something. Oh, hold on. Oh.
That's really cool.
So it like opens up as it opens up. Oh, cool. So there's a fold in there and it's got like a little bit of.
I don't know a local company that's good at it. I'm trying to get the name of them. There's an Israeli company that's really good at it, but that is going to depend on what kind of quantities you're printing.
You see that style of packaging, you're probably familiar with it with perfume samples that always have that same kind of spring, and those little vials of perfume are in there so that when you open it up, it's actually held with part of the packaging. And then I don't know what you pulled off there just because you're a little window on my computer monitor here. I assume that was part of the product or part of the experience. Yeah, it's kind of like a pop greeting card almost. Connect with us after. We might have something for you. Any other questions here? Smaller starting.
I'm not going to find on the fly because it's not a company I've worked with, but there's a big Israeli company that most of the major brands use for any kind of really custom packaging like that. I mean, that said, most local print shops should be able to figure it out. And anyone who's able to get on the phone with you and have a conversation about how to do it should be willing to take a look at it. In the board game space, Boda was quite good at it, but I don't think they do anything for consumer packaged goods.
Cool. Continue on, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, wrapping this up, the last thing I want to touch on before we get to the very end of this presentation is, what are your next steps? It depends on where you are now. If you're a new business, you're going to be knee deep in all the research we talked about. Define your needs, internal, customer, and distributor. Formalize your brand. If you don't have formal brand guidelines, you're going to need those in order to reach out to a designer, and then actually source some design support, whether that's a freelancer or an agency. This is if you're starting from scratch. Those are the things you want to look at. Again, most of your time is going to be spent on that research, making sure you get all of your packaging requirements down solid. If you're an established brand, this goes back to what we talked about with looking at some of your existing packaging. Audit your product line. Is it consistent? Is it affordable? Are there rooms to consolidate your packaging across your products? And does the brand need a refresh? Finally, if you're an evolving brand, if you're meaning you're doing very well in your space and you're looking for new opportunities, I'd be looking for new markets and redefine your needs based on those markets. So a perfect example of this is when we worked with Jacob's Maple Syrup to rebrand their entire line of maple syrup products. They were primarily selling in the gift store market. We're making a massive push into the grocery market. Now, the grocery market has a set of completely different requirements for product packaging than the gift store market. And so with that, they required some large changes to their brand and how their packaging was actually produced as a product family. So depending on where you were as a business, those are the three things. Those are the three places you might be, and those are the things I'd look at to move forward. And then questions. We're just opening up the floor to Q&A at this point. How do you get the slides? They are on our website on the workshop page, but you're also going to get them in an email that we send out within the next couple of days. In that email will also be a short survey on how you found this presentation, if you got some value out of it, any feedback you have with us to help us improve for next time, and then any topics you're interested in seeing us explore in the future. We're trying to do these once a month with Shopify. So the more feedback we get from you, the community, the better these are going to be. And hopefully we can tackle some more topics that you're really interested in. So when you do get those emails tomorrow, feel free to check out this video recording again to refresh on anything we've covered. And make sure to fill out that first survey so that we can make these even better in the future.